The Prime Minister says those who interrupted dawn ceremonies in Melbourne and Perth should face the full force of the law as Australians have paused to remember the legacy of the Anzacs. I'm Patricia, Karvelas, live from the lands of the Wurundjeri people in Melbourne. Welcome to Afternoon Briefing. The major party leaders both at dawn services this morning, the Prime Minister in Canberra and the opposition leader in his home city of Brisbane. Abhorrent, un-Australian and disgraceful. Politicians condemn neo-Nazis booing at the dawn service in Melbourne during a welcome to country ceremony. And with 1 week to go, we take a look at what the polls are saying as the campaigns gear up for one final push before voters cast their ballot. Prime Minister Anthony Albanese was at the Australian War Memorial in Canberra, making a point to celebrate the Australian spirit.
We feel them still near us in spirit. We wish to be worthy of their great sacrifice. Let us therefore once more dedicate ourselves to the ideals for which they died.
But the morning was marred by booing from a small group of people during a welcome to country at a dawn service in Melbourne, which has been widely condemned across the political spectrum. The Prime Minister labelled the group neo-Nazis and said the jeering was abhorrent. Opposition leader Peter Dutton also condemned the booing, saying a welcome to country was an important part of the Anzac Day tradition.
Welcome to country is an important part of official ceremonies and it should be respected. And I don't agree with the booing and I don't agree in our democracy that people can't accept the views of others. One of the reasons we're standing here freely and one of the reasons we live in the best country in the world is that our diggers in Villers-Bretonneux and Papua New Guinea, or those that fought in the Battle of the Coral Sea with the Americans, they fought for our right to express our view, and we have a proud Indigenous heritage in this country and we should be proud to celebrate it as part of today.
My first guest today is the former Deputy Prime Minister and now the Shadow Veterans Affairs Minister Barnaby Joyce, who has been attending several Anzac Day ceremonies throughout the morning and the day. I spoke to him a short time ago. Barnaby Joyce, welcome.
You're welcome, Patricia.
You've been to a number of Anzac Day services already today.
Yep.
Just talk to me about the crowd numbers and the kinds of people attending. What struck you?
More and more it has been the case since about the mid-1980s, Patricia, that it's gone from predominantly and overwhelmingly ex-servicemen to a day where the families of serving men and women commemorate and come out, and the numbers, of course, keep growing. It is, I don't want to be too effusive, but it is a sacred day for Australia. And the dawn service is certainly that sacred moment of the sacred day. And it's the emotion that you feel when you're there is quite astounding. Well, it is for me. Today I wear my grandfather, my father's medals. I served myself, but in the reserves. And you just think of what these people went. They were loved. They did love. They had no reason to go, yet they chose to go. And because they did, we have the nation we do. If they had failed, if they hadn't prevailed, Patricia, you and I wouldn't be having this conversation. Australia wouldn't exist. Yeah,
I mean, Anzac Day has, you're right, in the last few decades particularly, feels like it has grown in its significance, particularly intergenerationally. It's very noticeable. Yep. I mean, I live in Melbourne, but I saw people streaming onto the streets who were very different ages and backgrounds, so it is quite diverse. We do live in an increasingly uncertain and complex world too. We often say that, and we've been talking about even that in this election campaign, the most uncertain time since World War II. Do you think that's also a motivating factor as we think about these issues?
I think it's parallel, Patricia. I don't think it's motivation. I think if one person serves, then they might have 3 children, and then those 3 children have 3 children, and then the 3 children have 3 children. You've got 27 basically descendants of a person who served, and all those people feel a filial attachment to a former member of their family who has served, and in others it's brothers and sisters. And that basically has turned it more and more into an issue of families and an issue of civilians commemorating with the greatest respect those on their throughout the nation or within their own family line. It's their sacred day. I think, and parallel with that is there is a growing concern. Of course, you would have with the Chinese Communist flotilla circumnavigating Australia and then practicing live fire exercises off the coast of Sydney. I mean, we shouldn't have to be Sigmund Freud to work this one out. It's right in front of your nose. And then you have the research vessel stooging its way through Bass Strait, obviously trying to work out where your submarine cables are, doing oceanography tests, and working out where the points of weakness, where the points of access, and how you could absolutely decisively cut off communications and basically win any conflict in a very short period of time. And now we have the allegations from Jane's Journal, the Defence Journal, the statements about Russia wishing to set up a base in Indonesia. Now, we'll leave that to Indonesians to make their discernment of that issue, and they're saying that's not going to happen, thank God. But you see the Russians wanting to do it. It appears they want to do it. We are living in a different world.
We are living in a different world, but I will say, when it comes to the research vessel, I did actually speak to an expert who says that it was a pretty standard research trip and that it wasn't doing what you said in terms of the cables. And these are experts. I mean,
Were they on the? Yeah, I think I'd be careful that one, Patricia. Were they on the ship with them? I mean, really, you just got to. This is from the same political organisation that was doing live fire exercises off the coast of Sydney. They were certainly happening. So we've got to be a little bit discerning, and I think scepticism is a very healthy thing in this one.
But it wasn't just off the coast; it was in international waters, right?
Yeah. Why not go do them out in the middle of the Pacific? Why go off the coast of Sydney? What are you worried about there? An attack by the Antarcticans, or maybe New Zealand? What are you practicing for? Why do you need to practice there? What's the logic as to why you would practice at that point?
Do you think we are in a genuine pre-war state, or is that going too far?
Well, I think let's pray that that's not the case, but I think we are in a vastly more precarious position than, to be quite frank, you and I in earlier life would have been in, Patricia. And what I worry about is this time we are dealing with a superpower. Make no mistake about it, in areas of the defence where they're superior to the United States, what would we do if we were cut off, if our supply lines were cut off? How long would we prevail? And I've said over and over again, for about a decade or more now, Australia has one primary duty, and that is to become as powerful as possible, as quickly as possible, for the protection of our own people. And really, that should be the focus, absolute focus of how you do that. Because if you don't, and if the circumstances and luck and whatever go against you, you will lose Australia. And I'm not trying to be sort of excessive there. I really mean that. You'll lose your country. And
I spoke to Andrew Hastie, who is, of course, the shadow defence minister on your side of the coalition, in the coalition front bench, and he talked about that the world's changed because of the America First position of Donald Trump when it comes to defence too. Does that mean we can't really rely on America in the same way either?
Well, we know we have to believe in the signed agreements we have, but we have to acknowledge that circumstances have changed, and we have to also listen to other basic narrations that are coming out of the United States in regards to other defence agreements they've got with other people. Now, I believe 100% that the United States and ourselves have an incredibly mutually beneficial reason to be an incredibly close defence arrangement. But if our defence policy is that the mums and dads of Tennessee and South Carolina and California and New York and, I don't know, Minnesota are going to happily send their sons and daughters over to Australia to be shot because we weren't fully prepared ourselves, I think that is either a selfish defence policy or a very, very precarious and foolish one to have.
Earlier this morning, you condemned the actions of a neo-Nazi who disrupted a dawn service in Melbourne. Other politicians have done the same, the Prime Minister, the opposition leader. But I want to ask, isn't this a disturbing incident that demonstrates we have a bigger problem?
Well, it's, as I said, the most sacred time of the most sacred day for our nation, I believe, going across the board. Everybody's got their particular reasons, religions and other areas where they have. But in the generality, I would say Anzac Day and the dawn service is, basically the most sacred hour, the most sacred day for our nation. And for someone to believe that they have the right over the rights of the tens of thousands of other people sitting there and standing there in silence, in commemoration of the sacrifice for the nation, that another group has a right to break that silence, no matter what their cause, is an anathema. And of course, I'm very proud today. I've got my grandfather's medals. Here we go. Sorry, grandfather's medals. My father's medals. I served myself, but I was only in the reserves. But they fought against fascism. It's anathema to them. In my family, you weren't even allowed, when you drew a warplane, you weren't allowed to draw a swastika on it. They just hated it. I mean, it really was as strong as that. And to think that someone would go to it, and they were right wing, they were conservatives. But to think someone would go to an Anzac Day service and from a party that millions died in their ethos. Millions died fighting that. Australians died or maimed fighting that, trying to get rid of that filth. And
well, that's what I wonder. I mean, yes, Australians did die fighting that filth. I think that's appropriate language, and yet we appear to have that still in our country, disrupting key moments like this. It's pretty disturbing.
Well, I get strength, Patricia, from the other tens of thousands of people. I mean that. At the dawn service here in Canberra this morning, I would say there would have been between 30 and 40,000 people who came out in the dark, so they didn't come out to be seen. They stood in the dark, so they weren't to be seen there. And they went home in the dawn where it wasn't full light, so they weren't seen going home. They did it because they believed that it was worthwhile doing, that it was a sacred duty that they had for a very small period of time on behalf of their nation. And it almost makes you cry with pride, in precisely those words, to see those people. And they just, the beauty of that compared to the disgrace of the actions of a few. Yeah. I'm not going to let the beauty of so many be sullied by the disgrace of a few.
Peter Dutton today defended the role of welcome to country ceremonies at Anzac Day events and highlighted Indigenous Australians' participation in the nation's military history, which we know was, something they signed up to do at a time, particularly where they did not enjoy full rights in their own country. We can't ignore the fact that the heckling was not just on Anzac Day, it was targeted at Aboriginal people, wasn't it?
Yeah, well, that's pretty disgraceful too. When I was training in bush skills, it was Warrant Officer Perry, who was an Aboriginal gentleman who'd served in Vietnam, who trained me. And, ceremonies grow and evolve, and the involvement of the Aboriginal people in the services, I think, is very poignant. And if like everything, things have to be done with dignity, have to be done with decorum, and have to reflect also so many of the Aboriginal people who wore the uniform. And I was so lucky to have, served with or been trained by people who are of Aboriginal descent. And when I lived out in their families, there are bloodlines of Aboriginal families who they have generations of service and I'm thinking of one, servicemen, maybe probably service women as well. And that's to be respected. That's part of actually our culture as well.
Well, earlier this year, you actually defended your decision to acknowledge the Larrakia people. I think it was at the bombing of Darwin's ceremony, when Pauline Hanson denounced it as a tokenistic practice. Why did you decide to defend it? Why was that important to you? Because
there were Larrakia people killed. I don't get it. There were Larrakia people killed. It was actually an attack not only on Australia but also on their country. It was, they were bombing their country. We don't know precisely how many people died in the bombing of Darwin because some people weren't registered. And I think that when you step back at it and think, well, it's like they were breaking into their house. They the plan was to kill their people, I think that deserves an acknowledgement.
Just as we talk, I'm looking at, for instance, all the advertising around, in this case, it's news.com.au. It's the Trumpet of Patriots advertising. It's all around. It's yellow, it's quite bold, and it's overwhelming. And the slogan is, sick of being welcome to our country, vote one and their political party. I mean, you can't help but see that on a day like this and see what happened at this event and wonder if political discourse is part of the issue. Do we need to be having this conversation?
Not on Anzac Day. And, you know, Anzac Day is, as I said, sacred. It most definitely has a role for Aboriginal Australia, Indigenous Australia. My area, they refer to themselves as Aboriginals. That's why I do. And I think that this is not the day to do it. And in fact, I think as much as you possibly can, you should desist from partisan political plays during Anzac Day, because at those services the people of every political belief, every religious belief, and the one unifying thing is the commemoration and gratitude to those servicemen and servicewomen and the families also who make the sacrifice. Remember, when people go away, there's people who stay at home, and for them life is tenuous and stressed because of the service that has been done on behalf of our nation by one of their family members.
Just final question. Ukraine's ambassador has paid tribute to Australians who've been killed fighting Russia's invasion. And he said, in the truest sense, they are Ukrainian Anzacs. So this is the ambassador to Australia, and he stood outside the Australian War Memorial and read a list of 13 people from the two countries who had died in that war effort. I mean, I suppose this is not, you know, and they're not officially fighting for our country, but how do you see that?
Yeah, I don't know whether he should have done that. You know, you don't confuse issues. The Australian War Memorials are for Australian servicemen and servicewomen and the Australian families who have fought for Australia in an Australian uniform on the direction of an Australian government. Other issues may be important, but they're not to be confused with Anzac Day.
We'll leave it there. Barnaby Joyce, thank you for speaking to me.
Absolute pleasure.
For more on Anzac Day and the focus more broadly on defence this week, I'm joined now by Martin Hamilton-Smith from the Alliance of Defence Service Organisations. Now, the Alliance has written to both the government and the opposition seeking yes or no answers to 22 issues of critical concern for veterans and their families. Welcome to the program.
Good afternoon, Patricia. Thanks for speaking with us.
What are some of these yes or no questions you've asked in this letter?
Well, like all veterans organisations, we at ADSO are fighting for veterans' living conditions. And to start with, we'd like to see the veterans' portfolio in Cabinet. Prime Ministers and senior ministers send our soldiers off to war. They get the White House dinners and the pats on the back when our soldiers fight bravely and often die bravely in battle. But too often successive governments then allocate the veterans portfolio to a junior minister outside of Cabinet who has to fight for crumbs on the table, whatever's left after the budget process. That'd be a good start. Then, frankly, our veterans are living through the same cost of living crisis all of their fellow Australians are living through. A lot of them are doing it with disabilities and issues to do with their service. We'd like an independent judicial review of veterans' superannuation. There's about 4 schemes. Each one's peeled back veterans' entitlements. They're all indexed differently. They're treated differently by the tax system. Members have no portability. They're tied to CPI increases, where if they could portably move that superannuation entitlement into a sort of Australian super type fund where it's getting 7 or 8%, they'd be better off. But the Commonwealth has them stuck in a 1 or 2% per year fund. So that whole superannuation system needs review. It's not fair for veterans at the moment. The second one is the compensation and welfare payment system. We've got totally incapacitated soldiers, a lot of them. Some of them are in wheelchairs, so they can't work. Their rate of payment needs review. Some of it's not up with occupational health and safety systems in the various states for workplace injuries. Again, there's indexation and taxation systems that are treatment that is adversely impacting on veterans' financial welfare. And thirdly, on their financial welfare, it's time, we think, for the government to start to broaden the definition of qualifying service for pensions and health cards to include our peacekeepers, some of our soldiers who served in a war zone during a communist insurgency in Malaysia from 1968 to 1989, and our soldiers involved in counter-terrorism and special recovery. We've had 22 killed, hundreds wounded and injured on operations in CT. I was the commander of the 1st Counter-Terrorist Team. I know about many of these injuries. And it's time now to look at extending pensions and health benefits to these additional operational actions. These guys have nothing. Others, by virtue of simply being inside a war zone, have full pensions and health cards. So those three things, Patricia, I think are very important. And then there's some other important issues as well to do with the military justice system and the honours and awards system that also need attention.
So these are 22 questions. I'm wondering, have you got a response? You asked them for yes/no answers, which I think is a good way to frame it, actually, which is, you know, how do you stand on these issues? Have you got a formal response from the parties?
No, we haven't. No, we haven't. We sent both major parties and the minor parties, by the way, and independent MPs, our list of 22 questions. I would have thought an intelligent election campaign with Anzac Day slap bang in the middle of it would plan to have a release of a veterans policy around that time. There's been, as far as we're aware so far, no release of a veterans policy and no response to our 22 questions. Both major parties have had them for some time. We'd like to know before voting day so we can inform thousands of veterans and their families across the country what the major party's position is. And we've had nothing back. And I've talked about some of the financial concerns we have for veterans and their families, but there's others. We're really concerned about the military justice system. We question whether the government was wise to enter the Treaty of Rome and the Rome Statute in particular and subject our soldiers to the International Criminal Court. We've been through the Afghan war crime allegations issue. War crimes are just a thing now that you'll always get in whatever conflict you're in. We need to do better, and we think Australian law and Australian due process should apply to our soldiers, not some international court. We notice Alexander Downer said it was a mistake to sign up. He signed us up. We should reverse it. There's all sorts of issues to do with the military justice system that resulted in the mishandling of the Afghan allegations that's impacted all of our veterans who served in Afghanistan, and it's simply not good enough.
Don't we have obligations,
and on the other side of the ledger,
under international law that we clearly sign up to, not just when it comes to these issues, but a range of issues? That's our country is part of many of these agreements.
Yeah, and it's fine to sign up in certain circumstances to the broader issues. The problem is when ministers and generals in charge are so fearful of getting into trouble with an international court that instead of accepting responsibility themselves, they just throw the soldiers they commanded under a bus and blame them to keep their own sheet clean. And that's what's happened with this one. And by the way, Patricia, on the other side of the ledger, we've got dozens, probably hundreds of incredibly courageous soldiers who were recommended for honours and awards for their bravery in action in Afghanistan, and their recommendations were just put in a drawer, not to be opened, or their awards were downgraded. We'd like to see an end of war list and some of those recommendations reopened so that the incredibly courageous acts of some of our soldiers are properly recognised. Many some of whom gave their lives or who were wounded in action or fought to save the lives of their mates, were recommended for bravery awards and never got them. So, you know, they got the criticism when war crime allegations arose involving just a handful of incidents. But the honours and awards system is broken and it needs fixing. So we've listed all these issues in 22 questions. Neither the Labor Party nor the Coalition have responded. I just think in an election campaign where Anzac Day is a central feature of the campaign, that's pretty poor form. There's a week and a half or so to go, 2 weeks to go until polling day. We'd like to tell veterans and their families whether they will agree to independent judicial reviews into the financial conditions for our veterans. I've mentioned what they are.
Yeah.
And whether they'll look at this military justice system and honours award system and fix it.
Does it concern you that, politicians lean into the military, and obviously all of the imagery that goes with that, but without seriously investing in the issues here?
It does worry me, Patricia, and I think you've hit on a point. And look, veterans are proud to stand side by side with their ministers and their MPs on Anzac Day. That's great. But what we need our ministers and our MPs to do now is make sure that veterans' welfare is looked after. Billy Hughes, the Prime Minister during World War I, said in 1917 at a Premier's conference, you know what, we've sent these men off to fight and die in our name, and we've got an obligation to look after them when they come home. Now, those words still ring true. And yet, as I mentioned, both major parties allocate the veterans portfolio to junior ministers. It's hard to get money when you're not in cabinet. I must say the current minister, Matt Keogh, the Albanese government's done very well to combine 3 acts into one and simplify the veterans claims process. They've put extra public servants into handling claims from veterans. That's very good. If the coalition get elected, I hope they don't cut those front service positions because they're very important to veterans. But, where's the veterans policy? The major parties have had, weeks to think about it. Here we are in the middle of the campaign. It's Anzac Day. It's fine to get out there and talk about other veterans-related issues, but where is the response to these 22 very important questions about the welfare of our soldiers and their families? We've got wives and mothers caring for veterans in wheelchairs, and not just the physical injuries, but the emotional and mental injuries. They're relying on their families. They need financial support. There are some problems. As I said, it's not all bad news. A lot of good work's being done, particularly DVA. It's well led. But what we need some leadership from government, and it would be nice if both major parties got up off their chair. We've had Anzac Day. Find the 22 questions we sent you before the election campaign and give us an answer by Monday. So we need to get out to our veterans and tell them what the positions are from both the major parties, because many of them will vote on the basis of the answers to those 22 questions.
Martin, it's been great to have you on the show. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks for taking an interest in our issues, Patricia. Really appreciate it.
The Coalition's promise to end electric vehicle subsidies could drive up prices for popular EVs by more than $15,000 under a typical novated lease and have an almost immediate effect on sales, according to the Industry Association analysis. Now, one of the brands that this will affect is Polestar. Polestar Head of Communications, Larissa Mirabelli, joins me now. Welcome to the program.
Hi, Patricia. Thanks for having me.
Now, Opposition Leader Peter Dutton seemed to confirm on Wednesday that the Coalition would not touch the exemption from fringe benefit tax, FBT, for electric vehicles. And that sort of is a scheme, as just to explain to our viewers, it saves customers from paying the additional tax imposed when they buy a car through this novated lease system. Then he later clarified he had misheard a question, and the Coalition did in fact intend to press ahead with that because they want obviously the budget saving as well, and they don't think it's a good policy. What's your analysis on what would happen if they were to remove this and how it will affect sales of these cars?
Well, it's likely to have quite a significant effect because at the moment we've seen 60 to 70% of EV purchases shifting to a novated leasing arrangement, and that gives them access to this new technology. It enables more Australians to be able to have cost of living improvements. The cost of ownership is far less than a petrol or diesel powered vehicle. And so, yes, it is going to have quite a significant impact, not to mention the flow-on effect to health and the environment as well.
The FBT exemption was introduced in July 2022, and it had really an immediate impact on EV uptake. Just explain me for your business what impact it had on your sales.
Well, at the time, we only had one vehicle on sale in Australia. We now have 3, but it really attracted more attention to the brands that had already brought electric vehicles to market. Now we have, 100 electric vehicles on market and plenty that fit for purpose, whether it be EVs or hatchbacks and everything in between. And so now there's a far greater commitment from the manufacturers to bring electric vehicles to Australia. And just as we've got to that point, the Coalition now wants to take away one of the financial incentives that's going to drive buyer behaviour towards more fuel-efficient or zero emission vehicles. So it is really quite disappointing.
It has also had a big cost to the federal budget. The price of the scheme actually has blown out. It's gone up much higher than was anticipated, to almost $500 million a year. So that's much higher than the initial Treasury estimates. Do you accept that big price tag means that it's perhaps unsustainable?
Well, we haven't actually seen any of the modelling. We don't know how the Coalition has come to that figure, which seems quite extraordinary considering it's only been around since 2022. What I would say, though, is that utes and commercial vehicles have actually had the same exemption and continue to have the exemption, but their exemption started in 1986. So that's what I mean by driving buyer behaviour. We have this real anomaly in Australia with this, 22% utes and what we call LCVs, commercial vehicles, in terms of their market position. And that's really unusual. That's all being driven by these tax exemptions, and utes and commercial vehicles also have an exemption from luxury car tax, including those huge American trucks that we're seeing more and more on our roads. And luxury car tax alone, since 2000, it's costing us $250 million per annum to subsidise those utes and commercial vehicles. So in terms of how much we've subsidised utes and commercial vehicles for the last 39 years is anyone's guess, because no one will release the figures.
Some have said that basically EVs are an inner city thing, but just give me a sense of who's buying them, because I've seen conflicting commentary on who is actually buying these kinds of cars. Is it an outer suburban thing, or is it, what sort of buyer is typically your buyer?
Well, it actually has. It's shifted from sort of those more suburban and inner city environments to now being outer suburban. So, for example, Kellyville in New South Wales and Sydney, and Werribee here in Melbourne. So it's for people really who have got a longer commute, who may be feeling the cost of living crisis more acutely given the amount of money they're spending on fuel to get to and from work. So it's an unusual position that the Coalition's taken, considering the popularity of electric vehicles outside of these metropolitan areas.
One of their arguments is that it's sort of an unfair tax break on one particular car. What's your answer to that?
I really am happy that you raised that, because I think that actually the Coalition is confusing its references to tax here. So when Mr Dutton was questioned about this and he talked about the price of a Ford Ranger going up, he's actually confusing it with the new vehicle efficiency standard, or what we call in the industry NVES, which is an emissions standard that will come into play. So saying that we're going to have some sort of change in terms of how we're pricing some of Australia's most popular cars because there's now an emission standard is incorrect. We've heard from the largest car maker that they're not going to pass on any penalties to consumers because the market's just too competitive to do that. So if we're just looking at FBT exemptions, which is what this was all about, then that's unfortunate that they're even going to consider removing what is just a financial incentive to shift buyer behaviour towards cars that are more economical to run, and they have a less of an impact on our environment and better health outcomes for Australians.
Larissa, obviously this has become a big issue in the campaign. Those vehicle standards that have been put on by the Labor government, the opposition has also said, as you well know, that the penalty involved they don't want to include in the kind of phase-in of the new system that Labor has legislated. If they go ahead with that, what would the impact be on EV sales and electric vehicles?
It's really tricky because we work to much longer time frames than, say, for example, importing a pair of shoes. So we need continuity and we need the policies to stay. So brands have come to the party. They're introducing low emission and zero emission vehicles, which is exactly what was intended of that standard. There's 85% of the markets in the world have an emissions standard. We have to continue to progress in Australia. We can't always resist change. And this is one of those things that even some of the hardened-on critics is now saying, well, we've just got to get on with it, and we do just need to get on with it. If you remove the financial penalty, then it effectively just dilutes the whole program. So the car industry has already tried to do its own voluntary standard, and while it passed it on the passenger cars, and that's because the majority are being imported and meeting emission standards in other markets, when we look at utes and commercial vehicles, they didn't meet their own targets. And so you do need to have a penalty in order to drive the change that's necessary and to ensure that we're getting the most fuel-efficient vehicles in Australia, which is the whole point of an emission standard.
Thank you so much for joining us, Larissa.
Thank you for having me.
And many political experts believe the federal election could be won or lost in Western Sydney. That's a region made up of about 14 electorate seats. Now, the coalition is targeting outer suburban electorates where many voters are experiencing high rates of household financial stress. The region used to be considered Labor heartland, but the party's primary vote has been falling consistently for years. Earlier, I spoke with the CEO of the Western Sydney Leadership Dialogue, Adam Leto. Adam Leto, welcome back to the program.
Thanks, Patricia. Thanks for having me.
You've just published some new research about the high number of young voters in these electorates in Western Sydney. Just explain what is different about the demographics now compared to, say, 3 years ago.
So we've seen an increase of 200,000 residents, young voters in Western Sydney. And what's interesting about it is the increase, particularly in marginal seats in Western Sydney, in places like Werra, Fowler, seats that both parties have identified as key to winning the election. So young voters are going to have a role. They've got a voice. And I think it's in the interest of both parties to understand what those issues are and respond to them.
Yeah, you've also published research which suggests being able to afford access rather affordable healthcare is perceived as the number one threat by people living in Greater Western Sydney. Just give me a sense of why that's the case.
So we surveyed over 1,000 residents probably about 12 months ago to understand the issues that matter most to them. Not surprisingly, health and the health of their families was the number one priority. So what we did was unpack that a little bit further and find out the reasons for that. And the three things that stood out were access, affordability and availability of primary health care. So, looking at the policies and the ideas put forward by both parties, the investment and interest in improving Medicare is one that's going to be important for a lot of families in Western Sydney. And also on the federal government side, the focus on improving GP training so that we can make sure that we've got enough GPs in Western Sydney to keep up with growth.
The same research, I think, looks at how young people feel about the future, and I think this is very consistent with other research. They feel a sense of hopelessness about the future. Do you think any of the policies being put forward so far may be changing that view?
Not really, I think is the honest answer. I think there's certainly some signs of intent there, some lukewarm responses to addressing some of the issues that young people are dealing with, like housing affordability, cost of living crisis. So there's definitely an interest there and an understanding from government that they need to respond to it. But I think what that sort of demographic are looking for are meaningful, practical and big ticket items that are going to impact their lives in a really meaningful way. And I don't think neither side have really hit that yet, but I think that's what that demographic are looking for. I think issues that we've seen, I think that have cut through from our conversations are around the help debt and the federal government's position around that 20% decrease of fees for young graduates, which is big in Western Sydney. We've got over 250,000 graduates in professions like healthcare, social care, which are going to directly benefit from that policy.
Well, it's
so
interesting
those are the
you
sort of things. Childcare being another one.
That policy.
That's going to have the 3-day childcare subsidy, which is going to not only affect the pockets of families in Western Sydney, but also have the benefit of being able to open up more employment opportunities, especially for women. That's
what you just mentioned about a reduction in the HECS repayment by 20%. The Coalition described that policy, because it's on their list of savings, as being basically elitist. Who are the people that, you know, do you see it that way, that are benefiting from a potential policy like that in Western Sydney?
It's disappointing, and I think a little bit out of touch hearing that sort of language. The 250,000 young people in Western Sydney that will benefit from that policy are graduates in areas of healthcare and social care. I wouldn't necessarily call them elite. They're our carers, they're our helpers. If we can find a way to actually help them, I think that's a good move.
Heat is also a huge problem in this expanding region. Just give our viewers who perhaps don't live in Greater Western Sydney a sense of why heat is such a big issue and why it's become so front of mind. I mean, it gets to some serious weather extremes in Western Sydney.
Yeah, look, at one point in time, Penrith was declared the hottest place in the planet. Western Sydney doesn't benefit from the coastal breeze, unlike other parts of Sydney. So it is hot. I think, in short terms, the temperatures are a lot hotter, up to 5 degrees hotter in Western Sydney than they are in other parts of Sydney, especially in the east. The number of hot days or extremely hot days has increased significantly over the last decade. So every year we've seen an increase in the number of those days, which are days that are over 35 degrees, and those are tipped to increase over time. So Western Sydney feels it. I think they're aware of the impacts of climate change. They're living, breathing it, seeing it and feeling it every single day. And what's interesting is, I think, some of the perceptions around that as an issue for residents in Western Sydney. I think it isn't probably as front of mind as cost of living pressures and dealing with the day-to-day pressures that many households face. But what we're seeing, in terms of some of the data that's come out recently, that there has been a pretty big uptake in electric vehicles, in installation of solar panels. Western Sydney residents are looking at that as one of the ways to not only impact climate change and sustainability, but also the bottom line for families, making sure that they're incurring some savings on their energy bills every year.
In Western Sydney, I know there's a common refrain that people feel very much like the forgotten part of Australia's biggest city, Sydney. But at the same time, there's been an acute level of attention on Western Sydney because there are so many electorates being fought over there between particularly the major parties, but others too. Does it feel like that's changing? I mean, I feel like every second day we have one of the leaders there.
Yeah, look, certainly there has been a lot of attention, and I think rightly so. I think both parties recognise that there are some key seats at play in Western Sydney, and yeah, it's great to see them. I think we all love seeing our leaders out there every second day. But I think it points to the growth of Western Sydney. It is the third largest economy in the country now. Population growth is going to continue over the next 10 years, and within 15 years, it's where the majority of the city's population will be. So it makes sense that our political leaders and other decision makers are aware of it, are paying attention to it and responding to it.
Thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks, Patricia.
There's only 1 week to go before the federal election. Now, while this week has been marked by several public holidays, including, of course, Anzac Day today, it hasn't stopped the politicians trying throughout the week to make their final pitches and break through what has been basically, for a lot of people, a really quiet time. Joining me to analyse the week and where the election's going is Tom Crowley, one of our own reporters here at the ABC, and Katina Curtis from the West Australian. Welcome to both of you.
Good to be here.
Let's start with just today, if we can, and it's a very solemn day. It's Anzac Day. They haven't been officially campaigning, but there has been pretty strong words spoken in the wake of this booing at the Anzac ceremony in Melbourne, which was pretty disturbing to see. Wonderful to see at the MCG a little earlier, a kind of standing ovation, an ovation for the welcome to country from the huge Melbourne crowd there. I'll start with you, Katina. The Prime Minister used very strong language, talking about the full force of the law to deal with these people, and Peter Dutton too supporting welcome to country ceremonies.
Yeah, very strong language from both leaders, and I think particularly given that this was a protest led by a self-declared neo-Nazi, the leaders, both of them quite rightly making the point that, look, particularly on Anzac Day of all days, that's the kind of ideology that our diggers were fighting against, and it wasn't just in Melbourne. There was also some racist heckling during Welcome to Country, acknowledgement of country at the ceremony in Perth this morning as well. So, there seems to be a bit of a movement or disquiet across the country. I understand there's going to be some major, or there are planned to be sort of some major far-right rallies tomorrow as well, so kind of a precursor to that. It's definitely worrying, and I think it was really important that we did see both leaders come out and condemn this really strongly today. Yeah, Tom, I mean, the scenes were disgraceful, but Barnaby Joyce pointed out a little earlier, which I think is an absolutely important point. There are thousands of Australians who, did not feel that way and were not expressing that view this morning at dawn ceremonies.
Yeah, and it's one of the things, I suppose, the silence, which is such a beautiful and moving part of dawn ceremonies and the way that we commemorate Anzac Day and war more generally. I suppose it does create openings for people who want to take that opportunity and insert themselves in. So, I think heartening to see such a strong bipartisan response straight out of the gate from Dutton, from Joyce, from Albanese, Keogh, Miles. They were all really singing from the same song sheet. I think it's a good point that Joyce makes, that you don't want to give undue attention to something and let it detract from the purpose of the day, but at the same time you want to be clear in your condemnation of it. It's an unfortunate, I think it's been a theme, not just of Anzac Day, but the election campaign in general, that we've had security threats and just a sense that the way that we conduct politics and civil discourse has changed a little bit. Of course, we've got to be a little careful about the present bias with those things, and there have always been troublemakers and always been people trying to insert themselves in. But at moments like this, it feels, we talk so much about our social cohesion, like, of course, this was a year where something like this was going to happen. It seems to fit the temper of the times. It's made for at times I think felt like a jarring election campaign. Politicians not quite so, interacting with ordinary voters, and spontaneous interactions don't seem to be as much of a thing. It's an unfortunate reflection, perhaps, of the times that we're in, PK.
Look, timing is everything. I'm looking at the advertising for the Trumpeter Patriots, which is, Clive Palmer's party, which is he's clearly got a big budget, Katina, because he's paid for these huge ads that are around websites. I see it around the news.com website, for instance. And the slogan is, sick of being welcome to our country, vote one for them, right? I mean, Katina, you can condemn the neo-Nazis interrupting the ceremony this morning, and that's a very specific act of, I think, disgraceful behaviour. But this all operates on a continuum, doesn't it? This doesn't happen in a vacuum. Yeah, absolutely. And I think that, that is worrying. And it's not just websites. I mean, I heard he dropped more than $500,000 on ads on Snapchat as well, of all places. So I think that there is a concern about the way that this kind of is festering and not really festering anymore, like breaking out into the openness. And I think there is a job ahead after the election to really bring that social cohesion back together and really, it's probably incumbent on all politicians to do some kind of reaching out and some calming down and a bit of unifying work in the community. Yeah, and Tom, it just strikes me that, yes, part of the condemnation is that it's on Anzac Day, dawn service, minute silence. It is a sacred time, and it really is. I think everyone accepts that, actually, that this is not the time that you do that. But let's not forget the target. It's Aboriginal people that are the target, and Aboriginal people are facing, according to surveys and their own stories, increased cases of racism. And this is at the heart of this, isn't it?
It is, and let's not forget either that Welcome to Country itself has been a lightning rod for that in the culture wars of, I suppose, the period since the Voice referendum, and it's something that the Coalition has often as well been talking about, not quite as often perhaps as the trumpeter patriots, but Jacinta Nampijinpa Price has spent a lot of time talking about the amount of money that the public service spends on welcome to countries. There's been some sense within the coalition that view is echoed. Peter Dutton didn't want to go there today. He did make a comment to the effect that, you know, welcome to countries were an important part of official proceedings and should be respected, but the audit of Indigenous spending that he's promising to pursue with Price as the minister, should he form government, is a part of a policy offering that they believe will capitalise on resentment of acknowledgement of Indigenous culture following the Voice vote. It was a deliberate strategy. It's a strategy that has echoed as well the sort of anti-wokeness that we've seen of Donald Trump in much the same way that Clive Palmer's trying to do it. The echoes of Donald Trump are something that we know that the coalition got a pretty clear message from focus groups, from polls. It wasn't working very well with voters, and that they pivoted very sharply on trying not to echo that in the last week or so of the campaign. But it's one of many issues where they get wedged in an interesting position here, where some of the things that they've been saying to one group of voters over the last few months is out of step with what a lot of the Australian community seem to feel in the wake of Trump's election. And I think it's another uneasy one for them today.
Yeah, I think that's right. And look, you know, a powerful statement, can I say, from that huge crowd at the Essendon-Collingwood game, where I think Essendon is catching up, which really disturbs me as a Collingwood supporter, but I'm trying to park my feelings for this show. Let's talk about the big policy announcements this week, Katina. Big defence policy announcement from the Coalition, and then also from Labor for the establishing of a strategic reserve of critical minerals. But on a week where I don't know how many Australians were listening.
Yeah, I mean, it's pretty, like, it's school holidays most places. We obviously had the public holidays bookending the week. Great week to take leave if you're not busy reporting an election campaign. So I do agree, probably not that many people listening. Now, the defence announcement has been foreshadowed now for quite a long time by the Coalition. That was, as you say, a really big policy announcement. But again, it sort of almost risked them looking like they were leaning too much into that Trump agenda, given that the number that they've come up with for where they want to increase defence spending to is 3%, which is the same as what senior figures in the Trump administration have said they want Australia to do. So still a bit of danger there, definitely a big policy announcement. Not a lot of detail behind it. Again, though, is the problem that Peter Dutton and his defence spokesperson Andrew Hastie really couldn't say a whole lot about what they wanted to actually spend that money on, or how it would go. Interestingly, I've just reported this afternoon, the former Labor Defence Minister Joel Fitzgibbon actually used a speech to an Anzac Day dawn ceremony this morning to really put a rocket up both sides of politics over defence. He really says they're not acting with enough urgency. He says there's a sense of complacency in Australia about kind of where our defence forces are at and the threat that is coming our way in the not too distant future.
Yeah, thank you for bringing that to us. Yeah, that is quite significant. Tom, yes, the defence policy by the Coalition is rather aspirational looking forward without that detail. Did it capture the moment? I mean, the actual 3% spending of GDP over 10 years, which they say they want to deliver, is something that a lot of people have been calling for, experts that say we need to deliver on defence, but was the weakness not being able to say how?
Yeah, I think it was. It sometimes feels a little bit like, defence policy conversations become to life. It's been the long-running joke about defence, that defence policy is set by just picking a big number and then reverse engineering, what exactly you want to buy, rather than starting with the question of what capabilities you want and then asking yourself, well, how much is it going to cost? And we know that conversation's been forced on both sides by Donald Trump and by a global conversation that really just frames the entire defence posture of the world in terms of what percentage of GDP can you say that you are spending, with what you're spending it on almost being of secondary importance in that context, and maybe of secondary importance to Donald Trump. I think to start with a number and then work back towards exactly what you're going to buy leaves a lot of questions about, exactly what the defence posture is. The government went through a process over the last 2 or 3 years with its defence strategic review, where it talked more about an amphibious and a closer to home defence posture, starting to have that conversation. The coalition wasn't entirely thrilled with that document, but some clarity lacking on exactly what they think should be done instead. And I think in general, I mean, the coalition, I think the policies that we're getting at this point are the ones that Peter Dutton has been saying for some time, that we'll have more to say about this, and has sort of run out of time. They had been foreshadowing a defence announcement. They ended up splashing on a number of other handouts and maybe had a little bit less for that defence announcement than they might initially have thought. And that's, I suppose, the kind of thing that you get in the last week of what's been a fairly chaotic campaign. Critical minerals in a similar basket, really, for both parties. It's one of these things that both of them have been talking about for 2, 3, 4 years, pumping billions of dollars through about 5 or 6 different funds towards getting critical minerals projects off the ground. The business case kind of makes sense. China dominates this. We've got a lot of the stuff in the ground. Maybe we can sell it. But, a lot of governments have been throwing a lot of money after this. It's a pretty difficult thing to get investors into critical minerals because of China's dominance, because of what they can do to the price, and because they don't really want competitors. So I think it's been a lot of vibes-based policy making on a number of fronts this week.
Vibes. Look, in the last couple of minutes we have, the polls are all broadly, it seems to me, going Labor's way, but there's a lot of nervousness. And I heard one year quoted by the two leaders who you'd think, wouldn't be on the same page on many things. But Katina, 2019, they keep telling us about 2019.
Yeah, everyone's citing 2019 as a cautionary tale on both sides, as you say. I actually went back and looked at William Bowe's poll bludger tracker to look at, he's obviously been tracking the polls for this election cycle. I went back and kind of compared the shape of it to what was happening in 2019. So in terms of if you're looking at what the polls are showing you, they are actually quite different pictures. So I don't know, that maybe it tracks as closely as people are wondering. The main thing that I'm really hearing from both sides, though, is that this election actually really, the trend in the national polling numbers, not terribly useful. It's someone said to me this week, it's like we're having 150 by-elections. Like, it really is a seat-by-seat thing. Parties are talking about unexpected results that kind of in places that no one might have seen coming, like Bendigo maybe in Victoria, or just kind of unexpected weird results that might end up with a bit of a grab bag on the night of May 3. That means it's kind of tricky to tell what has actually happened in a kind of an overarching single narrative here.
Yeah, I think that's right. And just final one to you in the last sort of 30 seconds we have, Tom. The last leaders' debate, the fourth. Wow, there's been a few.
There have been a few, and look, I don't know that they're going to shift the dial much, especially when already 10% of the electoral roll has voted. I don't think this is 2019. That's not to say that I'm making a prediction about exactly what's going to happen, but maybe just to close out, I struggle to hear any Liberal sources who are saying anything greater than 10 seats for them. That's not enough to win.
It's not the
I'm
21,
not seeing that either side really thinks that's feasible.
Yeah, I think it's going to be very difficult for them to get a majority, but we don't know exactly the formation of the next parliament. You know what? It'll be fascinating, and the best thing is that it's actually in people's hands right now, so they can decide. Thank you to both of you.
Thanks,
PK.
And that's it for Afternoon Briefing for this Anzac Day. Thank you for joining me this Anzac Day. I know many of you are at home, or you've enjoyed some time reflecting on the country's history today as we've brought you some of these big stories. Just a couple of things to let you know about. Afternoon Briefing is on ABC iView, so you can just search for Afternoon Briefing and look up any of the shows and the conversations we've had. Also on YouTube. We'll be back on Monday at 4 p.m. and it'll be the final week of the election before Australia votes. Have a great weekend.